Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for H Soul War. I am the host, Niels Eichhorn, and I am having something very special today, coming, of course, to you from North Germany. But for the first time, I think, ever, I'm having a guest from the Southern Hemisphere and literally the other side of the world with me today. And I'm impressed how easily it was to schedule a time that worked for both of us, not being in the middle of the night or way too early morning hours where coffee can't even get it done. Um, so we are going to talk with Andrew Parnell today from Melbourne, Australia. Andrew is currently working on a economic history PhD, which he is going to look at Bruce Smith, an Australian politician from the early 20th century. But we are going to talk about his new book that came out with the University of Georgia Press, The Forgotten Man, Walter Hines Page, New South Visionary. Very heavy book, I would say, 346 pages, but very interesting to kind of see a history that stretches from Reconstruction all the way to the First World War. So, Andrew, thank you so much for taking a little time this Sunday to talk with me and share with my listeners about your book. So, tell us
Pleasure,
first of
Niels.
all,
Thank you.
how did you get interested in Page?
Well, it's a good question, and I just happened. I love books that are about like diaries or letters, history books who've got the actual words written by people in history rather than biographies about them. And I happened across the four volumes that were published by him about him in the 1920s by Hendrik, and came across them in a secondhand bookstore. Thought, oh, this looks interesting. Brought them home, added them to my pile of books to read, and actually sat there for maybe a few years. Um, but then when I started reading, I was thinking, wow, this is quite amazing, and particularly what he was doing during World War I when he was ambassador. So I just sent a few emails to a few friends and said, look, this is what this guy was doing, and so yeah, that's basically, and I just had a flash of inspiration one night. I couldn't get to sleep. I was on a work conference, couldn't sleep at the hotel. And I said, right, I've got to write a book about Walter Page. So, and also my kids, I've got three girls, and they were sort of teenagers. So they were becoming more and more independent. So I had a little bit more free time because I always wanted to write, but it just, yeah, hard to do it with young kids and always being tired.
How's that feeling?
Yeah,
I'm still waiting on the teenage years to come,
yeah,
or at
yeah.
least school age years to come.
That's right. It
But
does free up time once especially when they're at high school. Yeah,
yeah,
it does free up time, but even primary school.
yeah, but you're already pointing to something very, very interesting about your book because you have a full-time job, you're working on a PhD, you're having a family, and you wrote a book,
Yes,
which
actually,
like every
part-time
one of
job.
these is full-time job.
That's right. Yes, I do work part-time. I will clarify that. But yes, you're right. It is very unusual. There's probably not too many people that have done all those things at the same time. And last year was quite stressful getting it all done. But
Mm,
yeah, so I'm
yes,
glad the
when
book's done, so I can focus on the PhD now.
yeah, yeah, that it from what we talked before the recording sounds like a very interesting topic too to
Mm,
explore.
it
Um,
is definitely. Yeah.
yeah, so let's stay with you for a minute longer because
Mm.
you're Australian. You lived all your life, I assume, in Australia,
Yep.
and you're writing about an American author, or I should say, well, he is an author, an American
Yeah.
publicist, an American journalist
Yeah.
who lives in the US South, lives in New York, goes to London briefly. So
Yeah.
So you're literally writing about somebody on the other side of the world, that
Yes.
areas that you are not familiar with. So how do you feel like you bring sort of a an outsider perspective, a different perspective to Page and his study?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And I felt that a lot as I was writing it, that
Mm,
I was learning a lot,
mhm,
and I had to read a lot about American history, and there's a lot of words that are used that I was not familiar with. Like
mm,
they would refer to the North and the South as sections, and
mhm,
they talked about sectional feeling and
mhm,
the the differences between the two, and just the extent to which the North was well ahead of the South before the Civil War in terms of industrialization and just infrastructure and everything. Like
mhm,
all that was completely new to me. So
mhm,
but I had some great sources and also discussed it with a few people that knew about this sort of area. So but it meant that I was coming in fresh,
mhm,
and I think one thing that was particularly noticeable was how President Woodrow Wilson was referred to in his various biographies and just in history books generally. There's
mhm,
a certain reverence for, as a former president, there's sort of,
mhm.
which I think is more of an American way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And so what Wilson said was generally taken as gospel. It was,
Mhm,
he was the president, therefore what he did was, I wouldn't say largely right, but it was the correct thing. And Page to stand up to the president
mhm,
or disagree with the president was seen as a bad thing.
mhm,
Whereas coming at it more as an Australian point of view, I was looking at it more dispassionately, sort of saying, well, this is what Wilson said, this is what Page said. And Page has been heavily criticised
mhm,
for standing up to Wilson, but I sort of went right back to the very beginning of their relationship. And that's why I
mhm,
spent quite a bit of time on that in the book to say, well, it wasn't a relationship that sort of happened when Page became ambassador. It went back many decades, like
mhm,
30 years. And so they had that history. And then suddenly it was turned on its head when Wilson started to ignore Page. And Page was completely confused as to why. And most historians blame Wilson,
mhm,
whereas I was pretty sure it was Wilson that was the one that ended it.
mhm,
Page didn't change, Wilson changed.
mhm.
So it just, I think I'd bring that different perspective.
No, and it's easier for, like you said, with sort of like Wilson scholarship is very interesting, and sort of like the biographers who may not be as critical of their subject matter when it comes to Wilson. Some of them then overly critical, right? That Wilson is like this
Yeah,
naive guy that can't get it done, doesn't understand the world, and thus fails. Or the partisan ones, right? The Republican
yeah,
ideological based biography, and um,
yeah,
like, I mean, Wilson too has fallen because sort of his grace over the last few decades with sort of the racism stories that unfortunately are
that's right.
associated with him as well. So but
Yeah.
it was sort of it was interesting how early Page and Wilson connected, I thought.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, in fact, both of them were sort of finding their way. Both of them didn't know what they wanted to do with their careers. Uh, and Wilson was practicing law, but dying to get into politics. Well, had a lot of political ideas anyway.
Mhm,
Um, and it seems like Page sort of stimulated him to go to Johns Hopkins and study politics and gave him a lot of encouragement anyway.
mhm,
Yeah. So it was an interesting relationship, very interesting. And as I sort of mentioned in the book, Page treated it more as a professional relationship, I think. I think he thought, well, I can advise Wilson or help him as required.
mhm,
From early on, he saw him as having great political potential.
mhm,
And but Wilson kept referring to him as a friend.
mhm,
And I don't think Page ever reciprocated, not in that regard. He
mhm.
didn't. because Page had lots of friends, huge networks of people, whereas Wilson didn't.
Mm,
And Wilson often looked to Page for advice. Oh, I need someone who's an expert in this area. So Page
yeah.
would
No, it
he
seemed
would
like
provide him.
from what you wrote that like Page knew or was acquainted with like a lot of the intellectual elite of the United States during
Yes,
the late 19th and early 20th century.
definitely. Yeah. And he seemed to be very influential,
Hmm.
which it was an interesting, the whole influential aspect of it too, which I have tried to capture in the book, but he was extremely influential, for example, in education and
Hmm.
public health. He was a great success in those areas. But he, he was devastated that he couldn't do the same with racial equality.
Mm,
He was absolutely distraught by the when segregation came in that first decade of the 1900s. He was distraught, and just the tone of his editorials that he had in his magazine,
mm,
you could just tell that he didn't know what to do. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't understand why
mm,
people didn't treat everyone equally.
yeah.
And he was particularly upset because the South, which he'd been pushing very hard, probably all his adult life, really, all his career, pushing hard for the South to develop and
Hmm.
industrialize and be entrepreneurial and not be looking to the North for money all the time and investment, but actually for the Southerners themselves to take the initiative and start
Hmm.
businesses and be entrepreneurial. He was seeing that was happening,
Hmm.
and education had been was turning around as well. But he was distraught because the freed slaves, their children, they all missed out
Hmm.
because it was segregated. So he was really upset by that.
Yeah, no, it is a very difficult period in that he's growing up, considering
Yeah,
it is this
that's right.
aftermath of the Civil War Reconstruction period where everything
Yeah,
is sort of in flux. But I
yeah,
did enjoy that part of your book as well because you kind of you're working with Page there, but you're also already indicating that there is industrialization already there. Like that it's
that's
not
right.
like there's like this old perception that the agricultural South, the industrial North, and there's no
That's right.
industry, but there is industry, and
There is exactly. Yeah,
that sort of was maybe that's the outsider perspective, but it's sort of something that oftentimes sort of historians glance over and are like, no, it's this agricultural South, and it's like, no, there is industries
mm,
that you can build on, and I felt like Page really understood that and kind of brought that out and like, let's
exactly.
use this.
Yeah, exactly. And his newspaper, which was called the State Chronicle, which he only edited, well, he started it in 1883, and then he ended up leaving in 1885 because he was he could see that the Southern leaders were just
Mhm.
stopping him at every point. There was no he could see that he was just going to get more and more frustrated. But in that newspaper, he brought a breath of fresh air to the South, well, certainly to North Carolina. Uh, According to Joseph S. Daniels, who was a great friend of his at the time and ended up taking over as editor of the newspaper when Page left. But it was full of positivity. It was encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging people to actually not only buy Southern material, but not be always looking to Boston and the eastern states for investment and saying we can do it here. We
Mhm.
can we can start our own businesses, and that was interwoven with education, which was his real passion. He wanted a public education system that was open to everybody, and there was huge resistance to that in the South.
There still is.
Right? Yeah, yeah.
Um, but in I'm kind of blanking on this right now. He was not from an elite family, right? He was not his parents weren't that well off.
No, no, they weren't. And his father was very similar to Page, and that's what sort of tried in that the first chapter, I sort of try to capture that his mother was very much a reader. She was more
Mm-hmm.
highly educated than most women were of the time, and they're both from North Carolina, both his parents. But his father was, in the way he was, although his father's family was very highly educated,
Mm-hmm.
but again unusual for the time.
Mm-hmm.
His father and his paternal grandfather both started schools. In fact, one of his uncles also started a school. So they really strongly believed in education. Yet his father wasn't educated. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
have more than a very basic education, but he was a very practical man. He built a railway to get to a pine forest where he was logging. Built a full-on railway so they could bring the logs back to Aberdeen in North Carolina. So there's this conflict in a way for Page because he had his very practical father who, yeah, hands on, and his mother who was very highly educated, and she nurtured him actually in the early years because his father was often away on their business. So, but that's I think that's where he loved journalism. It
Mm-hmm.
allowed him to do both.
Yeah.
It brought both those characteristics together. So there's that very practical aspect to it. And he
Mm-hmm.
often said that, a good editor doesn't sit behind his desk. A good
Mm-hmm.
editor is out visiting the people.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit because that's a key
Oh,
aspect
yeah.
of what he does. But it
Yeah,
also strikes me as you were talking of sort of like this encouragement of education that he and his family do is sort of very opposed to what a lot of Southerners, especially antebellum, but then also late early post-Civil War, like there's always been that sort of I don't want to necessarily call it pride and ignorance, but this sort of like
yes,
we don't want this northern-based education. We want this homegrown, very basic education. You don't need to be that highly educated, um,
exactly.
college educated person. And he is sort of
Yep,
totally in counter to that.
that's right. And that's what Page had to fight with a lot in those early years. And in
Mm,
fact, probably throughout his career, realistically. But his great strength was his practical approach to it.
mm,
Um, And there was a classic quote from one of his fellow education campaigners who said he was too much of a practical man to be content in a professorial chair, or something along those lines. So, because pretty much in a way to sort of humour his parents, as it were, or to fill in with their wishes, he did end up getting a lot of education, and he went to Johns Hopkins, but he ended up withdrawing from there because he realised he didn't want to be a professor. But he always was grateful for that experience, and he learnt a lot in those years when he went to school. And I think that was one of his strengths actually,
mm,
because there was one professor, Chamberlain, in at one of the schools he went to, where he sort of turned around his thinking about the South and saying,
mm,
well, was the Civil War a noble war? Was it something worth fighting for? And
mm,
he's turning around saying, well, the professor said, no, well, the South was not developing.
mm,
And Page always went back to the leaders. He never really blamed the people because,
mm,
like you're saying, that there was this feeling that Southerners didn't need a Northern education. They had this practical education. But Page always blamed the leaders because they wanted to keep it into this
mm,
largely agrarian economy because that's where their source of power was. They were
mm,
plantation owners or politicians or religious leaders, and they wanted to keep people, you know,
ignorant.
poor in a way, yeah,
Yeah.
uneducated and poor, and they wanted to make sure they had education for their sons, so that they create this aristocracy. But so then they perpetuated this myth, which I call the antebellum myth,
Mm,
that it was glorious civilization. We wanted to be independent. We didn't need to industrialize. And Page spent a lot of in his newspaper.
mm.
He worked really hard to fight against that myth. And I don't know, you can't say that he was successful, but the myth was successfully defeated. And it, yeah,
Yeah, and it's sort of it's broader, right? That's sort of like when for some of the listeners who are familiar with the lost cause, sort of
Exactly.
comparing it, it's bigger than the lost cause because you're looking at much more, ma many more aspects than just sort of um, the institution
Mm.
of slavery.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think Page sort of thought that the slaves were just caught up in all of this, like they were
Mm.
used as pawns as part of this push to retain this
Hmm.
non-industrial economy as much as they possibly could, and the slaves were unfortunately part of that,
Hmm.
and and Page just thought that was so tragic that it was happened, and then of course that led on to the people was where they went along with the myth and said, well,
Hmm.
we're independent, we're not going to employ people. They didn't want to have anything to do with like banks or education. They didn't want their children to get educated because certainly as time went on, there was a risk that the children would leave the farm, and so they wanted their sons to help on the farm. They wanted their daughters to, help around the house. And so it it just fossilized, I think he called it, something like it just stagnated, and there was no
Hmm.
chance of moving ahead. And that's why he pushed so hard
Hmm.
for Southern development. And as I say, in his newspaper for that couple of years, he wrote more about developing the South than any other topic. It was just relentless positivity. He would just week after week after week, he'd go to a town and say, "This wonderful development's happening. I've got this cotton
Hmm.
cotton mill here, or um, schools are being opened, and people are getting educated." So he'd
Hmm.
just be relentlessly positive.
Hmm.
And he virtually never reported crime. He didn't
Hmm.
report lynchings. He didn't report crimes. He just was relentlessly positive. So
And
that
that,
was his strategy.
yeah, when you think of it, that's sort of what journalists oftentimes fall into, right? When you switch on the news, what do you see? You see
I
like
know.
I think in the US, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
the police chase on the interstate, or like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, oh, somebody got shot in downtown, or somebody tried to rob, and that's the
Yeah.
stories you usually read about or hear and
That's right.
see, and
That's right.
it's not that, oh, this school got like even like my wife had that a few times as a teacher in the South, and it's like, yeah, the football team gets always mentions, but like
Yeah.
Model UN never gets a mention in the student achievements, or like the student that goes to the National History Day and it advances to the state finals or state
Yeah.
championship, like it is very, it's very odd in how we're not doing this positive, encouraging kind of news coverage oftentimes.
Exactly right. And so he was very brave, like to
Hmm.
do that, because all the other newspapers, because they're all on Chronicling America, which is Library of Congress, is an unbelievable resource. And I was able to read other newspapers, not only his, but all the other ones at the time. And they just reinforced the stereotypes,
Hmm.
reinforced the negativity,
Yeah.
reinforced, the role of women in the house and all this sort of stuff. Whereas he'd be talking about a women's education conference, which was happening,
Hmm.
and the papers that the women were giving at these conferences.
Hmm.
So it was a completely different way of
Yeah.
approaching things.
No,
Um,
but as we were talking, I kind of also kind of was thinking that you're you're having here a person that is opposed to the elite's approach. He is very much sort of wanting to address the average Southerner, and he reminds me a lot of another North Carolinian actually, Hinton Rowan Helper, because
okay.
in the lead up to the American Civil War, Helper wrote The Impending Crisis to kind of talk to North Carolinians and say, look, this is not a conflict that is involving us. It's a conflict that is about slavery and slaveholders, and
Yeah.
it's it's sort of a very similar nature in what Page operates to kind of say,
Mm,
look, divorce yourself from what the elite white Southerners are telling you and do what's
yeah,
right for the state and us.
exactly. Exactly right. Yep. And trying to be positive. And his greatest triumph really was he initiated this idea of having a state fair.
Hmm.
in North Carolina, and it was held in Raleigh, in the capital, and he pushed quite hard for that in the State Chronicle. In fact, very hard, and he obviously contacted local, the movers and shakers in the business world in North Carolina, got them behind him, and it was held. It went for a whole month in 1884, and it was some people say that was the turnaround for the industrial growth in North Carolina. But if nothing else, it showed them that electricity. For most North Carolinians, that was the first time they'd seen electricity. Uh, and it just opened them up to the possibilities that their state had more possibilities than just agriculture, like
Hmm.
beyond primary production as well. And in
Right.
fact, when it was set up, it was supposed to be to attract Northerners to invest in the South. That
Right.
was what, not Page's idea, but the people that were running the committee that was
Hmm.
setting it up. But very few Northerners came down. It was mainly for North Carolinians that mainly
Hmm.
went there. And I've sort of got in the sort of final chapter that some quotes from various businessmen that said this was opened people's eyes to the possibilities of our state,
Right. Yeah.
and he pushed hard for that, and he promoted it. When it was odd, he promoted it every week, just talking about all the exhibits and what people were doing, what people were
Mm.
saying. Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Wow. Um, and so this is sort of the moment we're gonna stay for a moment longer in the South because
Mm,
Page, in its own way, is sort of a promoter of the New South and sort of
yes,
like, but
exactly.
in a very different way. But I found it very, and you didn't explore it much in the book, but I found it very interesting to
Mm,
kind of think of like, here's Page with a State Chronicle, a newspaper. He takes one approach to newspaper editing, and then you have um,
yep.
Henry Grady out of
Yes.
Atlanta with the Atlanta Constitution. He becomes sort of the person we usually associate as the architect of the New South because
Yeah,
that's the piece that everyone reads when we think of the New South. But
that's right.
it's like when we think of Grady's New South, it's a very racist, white
Yes,
supremacist, and it's almost
that's
like
right.
because that's what eventually wins out, that's what we think of, and it seems like they're talking to each other, even if we don't see it that well at times. But it seems
Mm,
like Page's New South is the one that we should aim for and pay more attention to.
exactly right. And that and the whole New South has been given, as I say, a very negative
Hmm.
connotation. It's seen as very negative. Um, and Grady, him and his contemporaries were sort of the first of the advocates for a New South. But
Hmm.
as you say, they were very conservative. They wanted
Hmm.
a New South. They wanted industrialization. They wanted that which Page agreed with, but they wanted to keep society pretty much the same otherwise.
Hmm.
And they were looking to the north, essentially, for investment
Yeah.
for this industrialization. Whereas Page and his contemporaries came a bit later, but they were, I call them like more liberals. They
Hmm.
wanted um, society to fundamentally change.
Hmm.
And for most of them, it was education. Most of them said, well, if we can get a public education system which is accessible to everybody, regardless of your income, your geography, class, whatever, everyone has access to this education system. They saw that was as the solution. And of course, Charles Aycock, who became governor of North Carolina, was seen as the education governor. Um, but where Page really stood out, particularly people like Aycock, they were still racist. They still believed that, yeah, the education, it's sort of, Page was pretty clear. He wanted Page education for everybody. But eventually, this push for education, they accepted that that would never happen. Like to get any education at all would be an incredible achievement. But so they sort of said, okay, well, we're going to have to accept that. We're going to have to focus on the whites first.
Hmm.
and then hopefully, yeah, then whatever we can do for the African Americans, we can. Yeah, so they just had to accept that reality.
Mm.
But he was the only one that was pushing for racial equality of these sort of liberal New South advocates, and that's where he really stood out.
Hmm.
And he wanted gender equality as well. Uh, he he pushed for the whole gamut of changes to
Hmm.
society and really wanted to destroy the antebellum myth.
Hmm.
Whereas the others were, a lot of them were really just focused on the education aspect and thought that would then give them what they wanted in terms of industrialization. Yeah, so that's why you have to leave the South, whereas all the others pretty much stayed in the South.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question of like, why did he leave the South?
Yeah, he left the South because he felt that he was not only was he ostracized and he was always going to struggle to get any, like he was editor of his newspaper, but he felt that he was never going to get anywhere in the South because the South was so parochial that if ever he criticized anything to do with the South, he was
They
set
don't like
upon.
that.
Yeah, he was set upon. But it became very ironic because he moved to the North, very successful in New York as a magazine editor. There was a magazine there that was on the verge of going, got Forum, the Forum magazine. It was on the verge of going broke. He turned it around, got the circulation up, and became very, very influential and very widely read. And he had Theodore Roosevelt wrote articles for it, Woodrow Wilson, a whole lot of very influential people all wrote articles for it. And then he left that because he wanted to get financial control because his dream was to own his own magazine
Mm.
and to be editor of it, like to be able to write whatever he wanted. And that was his great frustration in the South with the State Chronicle newspaper, in that he he owned it. Well, he didn't
Mm.
own it, but he was the editor. But he started it up. He had investors giving the money, the capital, including his father, to get it started. But he felt that he didn't have freedom
Mm.
because of the restrictions
Right.
of living in the South and not being able to really say what he thought.
Mm.
Because he would love to have criticized lynching, for example.
Mm.
But if he did, he knew he would lose
There's
a lot
no
of
market
readers.
anymore for his paper.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
he'd have no future. So
And
then,
I seem to
yeah,
remember you talked about like it was always financially struggling.
always
The State
financially struggling,
Chronicle.
yeah,
Yeah.
because he refused to get the government printing job
Mm.
because he realized that would compromise. He couldn't then be
Mm.
truly independent in terms of speaking out against the government. And so he was always financially struggling. And even Josephus Daniels, who eventually, as I say, he took over as editor,
Mm.
he eventually sold up
Mm.
um, because of the financial reasons. It was too hard. Um, so then, so sorry, I was going to say before is that so he was successful with the Forum. He left the Forum because he
Hmm.
didn't get financial control. He then was approached by the Atlantic Monthly to work there, and then he wasn't. He was sort of like an assistant editor, but he also had responsibility for books as well. And then, so the great irony was that the Southerners then thought, "Wow, he's one of ours," you know, sticking it to the Northerners, we're as good as Northerners, sort of thing. And so they didn't really criticize him anymore. In fact, they
Yeah.
praised him. So it was very ironic
Mm.
that if he wanted to get change in the South, he had to live in the North, as it turned
Right.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a subscriber to the Atlantic. I read their pieces like
Oh, yeah.
almost daily, but it's
Yeah.
interesting then when you kind of think of like, oh, Page, even though he's only the chief editor for like I think it's about a year, but he
Yeah.
kind of was in a
Yeah.
more prominent than just editor role there for quite a few years. And I
Exactly.
really kind of found it interesting how you kind of transition him from the Atlantic over to the World Works
Oh, yeah.
because of he just he wants to change the paper and
Yeah.
ends this focus on literature.
Yeah.
And it's sort
Yeah.
of the tradition of like no literature has to stay, and we don't do
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
like the Atlantic still does that. They still publish a poem or something
Yeah.
of that nature, even still today. So they're still
Yeah.
doing that very traditional thing. That Page was sort of like, nope, nope, we're gonna do something different.
Yeah. I think he ended up he accepted that that was part of
Mm,
the tradition, but he just wanted to make it more focused on the readers, like make it more contemporary,
mhm,
um, make it current,
mhm,
current news that would interest the readers, that yeah, get the balance right with the
mm,
literature. Whereas, and it was going broke, so
mhm,
he saved it from going broke, according to a couple of his successors said exactly that. But then when he got to the world's work, yes, that's when he really let go because he had full editorial control,
mhm,
even though it was part of the business, but the partners didn't seem to have
mhm,
any, involvement there. And he pushed really hard for Southern development there,
mhm. I
really
did like
hard.
how he also like wasn't it an author that was publishing with Harper Row, and he kind of brought him over to his new
That's right.
he kind
Yes,
of
that's right.
poached people.
Ellen Glasgow, he got to come over because he said, "Oh, they're going broke, so you got to come over to uh, Doubleday Page and Company." Yeah, and she was a great success story for him.
Yeah, it's kind of yeah, kind of funny how he kind of does that.
I know.
But
Yeah.
let's talk a little about his style of journalism because I thought that was also something
Mm,
very interesting because usually when we think
yeah.
of the late 19th century, early 20th century, sort of late Gilded Age into the progressive era, like most students would have read things like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and sort of know
Mm,
about like the issues with the meatpacking factories and the
yep.
slums in New York and what sort of
Yep.
is known as the muckracking
That's
journalism. And
right.
you kind of very powerfully say like that's not Page's style."
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, he's often given credit for inventing muckraking in a way, or what later became, he called it or I don't know what he actually called. I think he might, but investigative journalism is probably a better description of what he did. And he did a bit of it even at the State
Mm-hmm.
Chronicle back in the early
Mm-hmm.
1880s, where he would look, especially with education,
Mm-hmm.
he would get an expert, say to that expert, go and investigate this area. So he got an educational expert to go and look at schools,
Mm-hmm.
colleges, even the University of North Carolina, and then he reported the results back in his newspaper. He sent surveys to tens of schools or high
Mm-hmm.
schools, got them to report back, and then he did it definitely again at the Forum,
Mm-hmm.
the New York magazine that he where he edited, and at the Atlantic Monthly. So he'd get a topic, something he thought needed to be investigated, and take it further.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you say, he did do it with the meat packers and even with insurance.
Mm-hmm.
But he saw it as an end in itself. He saw it as that is an area that needs attention.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to look into it. I'm going to get some experts and investigate it. But he didn't do it to increase circulation, which
Mm-hmm.
of course the later the
Right.
ones the companies that really embraced it, yeah, they did it to increase circulation. But as he said, it's a short term. He saw it as short term, and that turned out to be the correct. Turned out to be correct. It sort of died out,
Mm-hmm.
died a natural death. But he was even with insurance, for example, he lost a advertiser. So it seems one of the insurance companies stopped advertising in the world's work, but he consistently had said that's even back to the State Chronicle, all of the
Mm-hmm.
um, media that he edited. He said that's my ethics. This is my morals. So he stuck by that, and it would have cost him
Mm-hmm.
a lot. But yeah,
Well, but I mean, right? It's like if I just publish anything, then where are my morals?
exactly. And that's right. It gave him a structure, I think,
Hmm.
to how to edit, what sort of stories he was going to run and what he wouldn't.
Hmm.
And he had very clear ideas
Hmm.
about what he wanted in his magazines.
Yeah. Well, no, and it's also when you think of like modern journalism, right? Like
Yeah,
I'm thinking of like how many times have I opened a newspaper or a news article from from a local newspaper in the US, and it just
yeah,
flabbergasts me of like, why didn't you ask this question? Why are you not like
yeah,
questioning? Why don't you ask like the depths
yeah,
of what you should be asking? Or the I have ended subscriptions to magazines because I just couldn't stomach the editing anymore because it was
yeah.
just so error ridden with grammatical stuff. And it is in that it feels very good to kind of say, okay, I'm not going to ask a journalist who needs to read up on, say, education. I'm going to ask somebody who is in education to
That's
investigate
right.
that, who knows what they're
Yeah,
doing.
yeah, exactly. And one of the most remarkable things I think was a series that he had for the forum, and I don't I don't think definitely would not be allowed to happen today. But he got an educational expert, and I think he gave him pretty much an unlimited budget, a limited amount of time, and said, "I want you to visit schools all over America and report back."
Okay.
And he did this over about six articles in different months editions of the forum,
Hmm.
and just blasted the schools. Like he sat in the classroom. This expert sat in the classroom and just noted how the teachers taught the kids.
Mm.
And he said there's too much rote learning, that the kids are not engaged. He just was so critical of it,
Hmm.
particularly in New York. He said that in New York that there was like the kids were just sort of they knew what they had to say to answer the question, but they didn't
Hmm.
understand why they were saying it, what it meant,
Right.
and apparently it led to a change in the way that schools operated in New York, according
Mm.
to a newspaper report I read later. So, but it was just the scale of this project
Hmm.
and the frankness, like the honesty of what was going on, and the fact that this professor was got access to the various schools to just sit there and observe what the teachers were doing and what the children were doing. It was quite remarkable, but so just incredible to read. Like it just
Hmm.
almost felt like I was there. I felt like I was in these schools
Hmm.
because I could relate to it. It's still schools are often like that still even today. Uh,
Yeah, no,
I could
exactly
sort of
right.
relate to this.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's when I read that passage, I was thinking in the very same way of like, how
yeah,
many times is that still happening? Of like the student asking you the question, even in the college classrooms, which I taught for years in
yeah,
the US, and you
yeah,
know what they're asking you is, give me the answers that you want me to write on the test, and it's like, no,
yes,
I want
exactly.
you to think of what the answer should be on your own.
That's right. That's
And,
right. And that was exactly what Page was saying. The children are not taught to think. They're not taught
mhm,
the cognitive development. It was just not there. Yeah. So it was amazing to read. Yeah.
I can imagine.
But I
No.
think that's where, yeah, that's his investigative journalism, which he very much saw separate to the muckraking.
Mm.
Yeah,
And there were also tr instances where he himself traveled to investigate.
definitely. Yeah, yeah. And in fact, he tried to make sure that either he or one of his, editorial staff at the World's
Hmm.
Work, that they'd be traveling every month. At least one of
Mm.
them would be out traveling to a different part of America. And there was a quote that I've got there about a man in Wyoming said, "Oh, you actually think Wyoming is part of America?" Because those states would have just thought, especially
Hmm.
the eastern states, were just, in their own world.
Right.
And the
Oh,
rest of
yeah.
America is sort of a bit of an add-on.
Yeah.
Uh, and New York dominated the magazine world at the time. The
Hmm.
American um, the US magazine market was
Yeah.
dominated by New York, so he would have been quite refreshing for them to
Hmm.
see
Right.
their states actually mentioned there.
Yeah, no, and like also that there's attention being paid to that
Exactly.
is
Yeah. Yeah.
now one thing I guess I gotta ask is like
Mm.
you read the world works probably all the issues or at least the
Oh,
vast majority of some.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
did you like literally keep like a an Excel sheet of like who wrote which article?
No, I did not that sophisticated.
Because
But
I found it very interesting of how you kept track of like how many who published the most articles in the world works.
yes, that was actually from another book. Um,
Okay.
yes, I got that from um, Bailey, who he'd obviously gone back and done all of that. Um, no, I wasn't. I wasn't that sophisticated, and also considering that he'd done it. So that was talking about how many African Americans actually
Hmm.
had written articles in the world's work, which was again part of Page's philosophy.
Yeah, no, I was impressed
What?
that
Yeah,
like I was surprised Du Bois didn't have as many articles, but Washington
yeah,
having 12 articles, that was impressive.
I know exactly. Yeah, he thought Washington was one of the greatest men in America, if not the
Hmm.
greatest. At one point, he said he's the man that we can do the least without at the
Hmm.
present time because of what he was doing for education for the African Americans, and
Hmm.
given that they were being ostracized from
Yeah.
the the education system generally. Um, I know Du Bois. He, of course, later on, because he agreed with Washington's philosophy.
Hmm. And
Du
Du Bois
Bois,
does not agree with that at all.
no,
So,
exactly. So, but to Page's credit, he often did that. He'd
mm,
have people in there who he didn't agree with
hmm.
their philosophy, but if he thought they were going to write well on the topic, they were
Hmm.
experts. And that article about Du Bois, that town in Georgia, where
Hmm.
the whites lived on one side of the road, the blacks lived on the other, and it was just, and the photos, which I didn't put any in the book, but it was just abject poverty, really. But it was a positive article in a lot of ways. He was saying
Hmm.
that what Du Bois did, he humanized the people. He said,
Hmm.
this person that, this former slave, he he's just like every other American. He has dreams. He
Hmm.
wants to um, have a family. He wants to have a career. He's a person like anyone else, and that's
Yeah.
exactly Page's philosophy. So yeah,
Right. No, yeah, exactly. Um, kind of looking at my list now, kind of like, wow, I like in there are there's so many items in the books where you can be like you can read it and you're like, wow, he's already thinking about that in 1900 and we're still debating it 120 years later. And one
exactly.
of the big debates that he got involved in was
Mm.
tariffs, right? That and that's like just strikes through modern that like we're like we're still debating tariffs, whether we should have some or not. And Page very clearly told us no
No, sorry, what was that? The
tariffs.
Oh, tariffs, exactly. Oh yes, yes, he, and that's what brought him and Woodrow Wilson together actually,
Hmm.
because there was this tariff commission going on, which he was covering for the World, the New York World newspaper. And then he met Woodrow Wilson, who was a friend of a friend. And Page encouraged Wilson to go and speak at the Tariff Commission against tariffs. And his argument was that tariffs discriminate against the South because the
Hmm.
South's industry was so small, and all it did was help
Hmm.
the northern businesses or the business in the eastern states. But of course, it made everything more expensive in the South. So what they were exporting wasn't was was not covered by tariffs, but what was imported was covered by tariffs.
Hmm.
So whether they bought the local produce
Hmm.
or the imported products, it's going to be more expensive. and so it discriminated against the South. Yeah, he was passionately against it. And again, yeah, well ahead of his time.
Yeah, no, and very logical, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
exactly like I showed students the other
yeah,
day. We talked about tariffs, and we talked about
yeah,
like how if you put a tariff on imports, the
yep,
import becomes more expensive, but the domestic producer also raises the price because they can now ask for more.
exactly.
And
They can ask
like,
for more. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And you said it was, and of course, if you've got a business, say in Boston,
hmm
you can do quite well,
yeah,
and you can pay your staff more, and so those people all do quite well
sure,
out of it. Um, but yes, and he was very pragmatic in his politics.
hmm
So, obviously, the tariffs was a Republican policy, and Roosevelt, who he loved, he thought was fantastic, but they very much did not see eye to eye on
hmm
tariffs.
Yeah, he
Uh,
does change politics, doesn't he?
he does. Very pragmatic.
hmm
Yes. Yeah. So, and he thought Grover Cleveland was fantastic
hmm
because Cleveland opposed tariffs, and he was a real trailblazer in that regard, especially his first term, I should say. Yeah.
But no, yeah, it's sort of an interesting like he's not like there's certain issues he's very like all career long he seems to embrace, and then in politics it's sort of like he goes with whoever kind of fits best that
Exactly.
sort of agenda that he has.
Mm. But I'd probably say that it was the politicians and the political parties that were changing more than Page, because he
Yes.
was pretty consistent throughout his life. He
Yeah.
didn't really change on most things,
Mm.
which was quite remarkable, really, considering how controversial his ideas were. Like it would have
Considering the
been easy
pushback,
for
yeah.
him. It would have been, yeah, it would have been easy for him to say, "Oh well,
hmm
you know, disfranchise the freed slaves, away we go."
Right.
But he was so and passionate that he couldn't understand it. I think he literally couldn't understand
hmm
what was happening.
Right.
That
Yeah. So now we're back to Wilson in many ways, and they're working very close together. Wilson being in New Jersey at Princeton and Page being in New York as a newspaper editor. And
right,
they're both coming from Southern locations,
yep.
um, very different backgrounds, obviously.
Mm,
And how how does Page contribute to Wilson's rise? Like, I mean, he's a college professor. We have never before
no,
or after had a college professor who becomes president.
I know. It's quite remarkable, isn't it? Um, and from what I gather, he was very much of he was a great speaker. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He was very convincing, but I suspect one on one, he was probably quite maybe wooden, I suspect,
Mm,
like not very open, not very friendly.
mm,
But so what Page obviously, because they'd been friends for so long, so by the time in 1912, well, in fact, it probably would have been 1911, yeah, 1911, probably when they first started thinking about, he started thinking about running.
mhm,
Page had for a long time sort of thought, oh, yes, he's a man that could become a political leader. But more importantly for Page is that they agreed on practically everything. Obviously, tariffs, the importance of democracy, the importance of freedom,
mm,
the importance of the South catching up with the
mhm,
North. And even I think Page sort of thought that Woodrow Wilson might also be a bit more responsive to the idea of America taking on a world leadership role,
mhm,
which is what Page wanted.
mhm,
Not to lead the world as such, but to take its place
mhm.
amongst the European nations as,
Right.
a genuine contributor to where the world's heading, sort of thing. Whereas America had no interest in that whatsoever. And then so Page uh, pushed very hard because he had the world's work by then, which was again a very influential magazine. He got together with two other people, and they sort of worked out a way that Wilson could run for president, like to get the Democratic nomination because he was governor of New York, get the Democratic nomination. And so they said, well, why doesn't he go on a speaking tour
Mm.
of the West? So and Wilson did not want to do it because he wanted to be a very old-fashioned notion. He wanted to be pushed to
Mm.
become the candidate or to nominate for the Democratic Party. Uh, but Page eventually convinced him, yes, you need to do this. So he went on this speaking tour, and apparently it was a huge success. And everyone just wanted, because he wanted to talk about education, I think, and other things, but everyone just wanted to talk to him about politics and him running for president. So when he got back, then Page, he couldn't get too involved.
Mhm.
Partly he was too busy because he had magazines to run. Um, and he wasn't a day-to-day political person, and I think
Mhm.
it took him a while to realize that
Mhm.
he wasn't someone who could run a political campaign or be out and about,
Mhm.
door knocking and shaking hands and doing that sort of thing on behalf of Wilson. He realized his best skill was promoting in his magazines,
Mhm.
which he did. And one of the authors I've quoted in the book says that it's could have what he did for Wilson in the world's work was quite probably unsurpassed in American history in terms of promoting a candidate, and it was relentless the way he promoted Wilson.
Mhm.
Not in an over top way necessarily, but it was more factual. This
Mhm.
is what he's done. This is what he's going to governor of New Jersey, even though he'd only been there for about a year,
Yeah.
but he still he captured that. So it was a bit of hyperbole there, and it was exaggerated, but it was something that he thought was based on fact.
Mhm.
So he pushed very hard there, and then Wilson ended up getting the Democratic nomination.
Mhm.
And it was quite funny actually, because as you say, he was a university professor, and some of the Democrats, like the party bosses, thought, well, we'll be able to control him.
Mhm.
And they hadn't been able to when he was in New Jersey as governor. And of course, they never did as president either. And he wasn't really involved in the presidential campaign again for that reason. I think he just let that play out.
Yeah. And
Um,
it's sort of because once Wilson becomes president, Page is sort of like looking at different possibilities of what he could
exactly
do.
to
It was
contribute. Yeah,
yeah, the contribution he could make, and it was because we're sort of moving beyond the spoil system, or we're still sort of in the spoil system too. So it's like
yeah,
he
yeah.
was a great contributor to Wilson's victory. So Wilson feels
Yep.
sort of like we should give him something.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, give him a cabinet role. And
Yeah.
interestingly, the others that have written about Page sort of indicate, imply, or even directly say that Page wanted to be a cabinet minister, but he did not. He didn't want to be a cabinet minister. He would have, because he was too independent, had,
Mm-hmm.
he had too much of his own ideas. He would have, because obviously there's the cabinet solidarity. He wouldn't have been able to speak out against the government. Not that he would have anyway, but like he wanted to be an unofficial advisor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think then he still wouldn't have spoken out against the government, but at least he would have had that freedom to
Mm-hmm.
advise across the whole gamut of all the policies.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
probably didn't want to be restricted to just one
no,
area, right? Or like education. Yeah, I like education, but I want more than that.
exactly, because he saw society as a whole
Mm-hmm.
rather than just, and he saw how interrelated everything was. And it's interesting because Edward House, who again, this is coming from an Australian perspective. I'd never heard of him before,
Mm-hmm.
and I suspect probably a lot of Americans never heard of him either. But I thought, who is this person? and he's not, I couldn't see him anywhere as an official advisor or anything. And it wasn't until I found a few, or one book in particular just describes him as sort of an unofficial advisor.
Hmm.
And there's this great book about the relationship between the two of them. It's, unlike anything in American history, where he was not employed, but he was by far and away Wilson's uh, biggest influence, biggest advisor.
Hmm.
But House had this, he was from Texas, but lived in New York, and he'd been doing this sort of political advice for a long time,
Hmm.
mainly with, Texas governors and Texas politicians.
Hmm.
And he wanted to have this influence over Wilson, and he resented Page because he realized that Page would have much more con
Hmm.
of an intellectual contribution. And there was someone else as well who same. So House didn't want Page to be in the cabinet, and House was quite happy with the idea of him being sent off to London as an ambassador because he realised that, especially back then when communication was so, well, primitive as we would call it today, but you couldn't
Hmm.
just not even have phone calls. So it meant that you just communicating with letters, and it's never as good. You can never get the nuances and all that sort of thing. So Page really was shut off, and House was very happy with that because otherwise Page could have ended up being his main advisor.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
seemed like this was as much as it's supposed to be a reward. It seemed like this was an exile for Page.
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Get him out, get him away.
and I found a great entry in his diary, which I hadn't, other authors hadn't picked it up, but it was where he and a couple of other people went to meet with Wilson as president to talk to him about giving more to the education campaign.
Hmm.
And Wilson agreed to do it. And that's exactly what Page wanted to do. He wanted
Hmm.
to be doing that sort of work. And that's how, and semi-retire
Hmm.
back to the pine trees in North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting. Would have it's sort of like, I mean, we're historians, so we can't really predict, but it's sort of an interesting
Mm,
counterfactual what if scenario of like if Page had stayed in the
yeah,
States, would Wilson have like would he have segregated the federal administration, right? Would he have done certain
yes,
policies
exactly,
domestically that he did?
exactly. And would he have taken the people like because Page, of course, was ecstatic when he had it because Wilson cut tariffs really
Hmm.
hard and introduced an income tax to make up for the lost revenue.
Right.
But it was I don't know how it went over politically at the time, but as soon as Wilson left office, those policies were reversed. And I just don't think that Wilson sold the policy to the people enough. It was
Hmm.
more aloof college professor, maybe, sort of.
Yeah.
Whereas if Page was back there with the world's work, yes, he would have sold them. I think
Hmm.
that's a really good point. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I know it's in a way America would have been better off if he hadn't become ambassador. But
Oh well,
yeah,
that's a major what if scenario right there.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so now obviously Page gets into a very historic office there with the
Mhm.
representation of the United States in London. But his first 2 years are relatively easy in
That's right.
in
Yeah.
contrast to the last few years of his position.
Yeah. And there was a complete turnaround. As you say, the first, well, it's, yeah, so 1913 and then most of 1914. Yep. It was exactly how he envisaged it. He was, excuse me, mingling with great people and poking fun at them in a way in his letters back to Woodrow Wilson. But his letters to Wilson are just, they're, they're just brilliant. And Wilson did say that Page is the best letter writer
Mm,
he'd ever known, and
mm,
he hoped that Page's letters would be published one day.
mm,
Um, and he often apparently he'd read them out to cabinet meetings, read
mm,
excerpts from the letters because these letters helped Wilson understand what he felt like he was there in
mhm,
London or whatever part of England that Page happened to be in. Um, the Page thoroughly enjoyed it. He embraced
Mhm.
it. It was a role cut out for him. There was two major diplomatic crises that were happening, which he resolved.
Mhm.
One where he thought America was in the wrong, and the other when he thought Britain was in the wrong. So he was impartial. He wanted, he just sort of said, well, this is what he understood to be the actual
Mhm.
facts and the reality. And he was able to convince Wilson, especially on one of them, where he thought America was in the wrong. He was able to convince Wilson to use up some of his political capital
Mhm.
to resolve the issue. Um, so that was about the Panama Canal. Yeah, so he was well suited for that role, and that would have, yeah, if that was how it panned out, it would have been a triumph. And their
Yeah.
relationship was very strong. And
Mhm.
Wilson continually wrote to him, say, "What a great job you're doing.
Mhm.
You're doing exactly what I want you to do. You're my eyes in America, in London, that sort of
Mhm.
thing."
Yeah, and then unfortunately July 1914 comes and things
Yeah.
turn south very quickly and Will's like we're obviously, and this is diplomatic historians have written a lot about like the relationship Wilson and House, of how House is influencing Wilson and sort of the
Mhm.
policy decisions. And Wilson adopts this really awkward, I always found, policy of like neutrality in sort of political, but also sort of in mind that we're
That's
even
right.
mentally not going to take any sides. And his
That's
key
right.
ambassador in the UK is saying no.
That's right. That's right. And this is where Page is really heavily criticized because he would continually be writing back and pointing, saying at how he thought it was and how America should take a world leadership role. And interestingly, and he's been heavily criticized for it. But Page never really, until right at the end,
Mm,
he never really wanted America to join the war in terms of troops, sending troops.
mm,
Page's argument pretty consistently was America needs to stop trading with it, it could stop trading with all the
mhm,
belligerent nations,
mhm,
or if we wanted to stand up for Germany, he would say, if we want to if we want to stand up for democracy, we can just trade with um, the Allies.
mhm,
And then, but he said American trading with these countries is
mhm,
giving them even the cotton which they were using for the uniforms, they were
mhm,
using the explosives.
yeah,
And also, he said that stop with the neutral countries as well,
mhm,
because the data which I've got in the book shows that the materials going through the neutral countries that
mhm,
bordered Germany
yeah,
and into Germany, so they're getting their supplies.
mhm,
So that was his argument consistently. Whereas it's sort of this. Some people just say, "Oh, he wanted America to join the war," but he it wasn't until the very end when he realized that it was too late for that to be effective anyway. That he was happy when they joined, militarily they joined.
yeah.
Uh, and he
And
wrote this great letter in 1914, which sorry, 1915, early 1915, which I refer to as, his leadership letter, where he laid out the various options that America could
mhm,
do. They could even join a bit of an ally with the other neutral countries, have a bit of an
mhm,
alliance with them, and just stop goods getting to Germany
mhm,
that they could then use in the war. And Wilson never replied to that letter.
mhm,
And that was pretty much the end of their relationship. Because Wilson just stopped replying to Page's letters
mhm,
because he said Page is not being neutral, but Page was not being unneutral. He was actually trying to help the world, trying to help America, help democracy, and
mhm.
end the war.
Yeah,
But,
it's an interesting it's an interesting situation that he is in that moment. And
mm,
I really loved how you had that. this this effort where House and Wilson are like, ah, he's so embezzled by the British. He's just following their propaganda. We need to bring him back, and he needs
Yeah,
to soak in
yeah,
the American situation.
yes, that's right. Yeah, so that was in sort of the second half of 1916. They thought he'd been brainwashed by the British. He
Hmm.
didn't understand what Americans were thinking. But of course, it was the opposite. He thought the Americans had been brainwashed by this. Well, I call it the myth of neutrality.
Yeah.
So the myth that America could be neutral and just sit there and let the war happen, and it's not going to have an impact on them,
Hmm.
where it was, which was very clearly not the case, especially when Germany sent the telegram to Mexico, getting Mexico to invade America to distract them
Hmm.
from the war.
Yeah.
So, you know,
I did enjoy like I don't like I haven't read as depth in depths, but I had some diplomatic history courses in college, and
mm,
I had to read some books on Wilson. I don't think I have ever seen. I mean, I've seen like the like and I've heard the story of like the British having to kind of figure out how to hide that they were spying on the cables and had found this
yeah, got
figured
the
this
code.
telegram. I don't think I've ever seen anything about Page's role in kind of that
Okay.
cover up. So that was something very new and interesting that I found like
Mm.
he's very much very deeply involved in this.
Very much so. Yeah. And I think the British were happy to let him deal with that situation to
Yeah.
see how we can send it to because they agreed to what the strategy was going to be. They let
Hmm.
Page write the letter
Yeah.
to Wilson or to the State Department and explain what had happened.
Hmm.
Um, and the way they would make it public without any clue that the Germans would have figured out that they knew what the code was because
Hmm.
they were just to decipher it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So um, and it's funny his attitude. He was by then he was very, what's the word? He sort of, he'd given up hope that Wilson
Hmm.
would ever take action to end the war.
Yeah.
Uh, and he sort of sent off his letter to Wilson with this called the Zimmermann telegram, which was after
Hmm.
the German foreign minister who actually sent it. He sent it off to the State Department. He said, "Well, any other country that would be there'll be a declaration of war. Who knows what's going to happen with America?" He was, yeah,
Yeah. He seemed frustrated
very
that he was
frustrated.
not being listened to, that he was sort of being ignored, and
Exactly.
um,
And I think that's the great unfairness with the whole thing that he, Wilson, as I said in my, the second last chapter, when I talk about the myth of neutrality, and even I think even actually in the chapter, because Page was over there,
hmm.
couldn't pick up any nuances. He couldn't like if he went to Wilson and said, "Look, I think we really need to stop supplying the Germans or the Allies or
Hmm.
whatever." He'd be able to pick up from Wilson's body language that he's not interested because Page was very good at dealing with people. He had great
Hmm.
people skills. And he could have just said, okay, well, I realize that's not going to work. I need to try another strategy.
Hmm.
But he couldn't do that. Whereas the Secretary of State, who was back in Robert Lansing, who was back in
Hmm.
obviously in Washington, Edward House, who was in Washington, they could, and everyone else who was dealing, they could pick that up. They could
Hmm.
realize that Wilson, and he would obviously have been chatting to them, like having informal chit chats in the corridor
Yeah.
or just in the whenever. So they would pick up on all this, whereas Page
Hmm.
was completely separate. So he couldn't pick up on any of this.
Hmm.
So really, a letter needs to be sent to Page to say, look, we recognize that this is what you think, but we don't think public opinion is with us just at this point.
Hmm.
So we're going to have to keep trading, but we'll keep you up to date or whatever.
Right.
But they never did, as far as I can find any letter to that extent. And yeah, so he
Well,
was left in the dark.
it also kind of feels a little bit of like Page is still in this sort of like he has had for like 15, 20 years, he had an audience of
Yes,
thousands of readers. And all of a
exactly.
sudden, like he
Yeah,
is ambassador of the United States to the UK, and he has an audience of maybe four people reading his stuff.
that's right.
So
That's
it's
right.
a very different environment that he's operating in there too, with sort of like
Mm,
its readership.
that's right. And he's very, as I say, he's very much a people person as well. He
Hmm.
he liked to understand his readers. He liked to
Yeah.
know what his readers wanted.
Hmm.
And if he was trying to influence his readers, he wanted to
Yeah.
be able to get a feel for who they were,
Hmm.
and he struggled with Lansing
Hmm.
because he took over as Secretary of State sort of after about a year, when the great commoner was who was a previous Secretary of State, whose name does slip
William
my
Jennings
mind.
Bryan there.
That's right,
Yeah.
Brian, of course, yeah, yeah. So he knew Brian. He
Mm.
had dealt with him before and never liked him.
Yeah.
He thought he was a populist. Uh, but and Lansing, he just thought he thought he was a bit of a like a clerk, like a
Mm.
a glorified public servant, sort of that
Right.
didn't really belong in the job, and never really
Mm.
got to understand Lansing and how to communicate with him.
Mm.
But Lansing, funnily enough, agreed with Page the whole time.
Mm.
Lansing agreed that the Germans had gone too far,
Yeah.
and to stand up for democracy, America needed to do something,
Mm.
and that would be stop trading with them. And I think House did as well.
Mm.
After, so this was about 6 months into the war. Both of them pretty much said, but they didn't say it to Wilson because they knew they'd be ostracized.
Mm.
As I say, because of these, they understood where he stood. But Wilson never told Page this, so
Yeah.
Page never had that benefit. And look at yeah, he Page went over the top. Really, he sent pages, letters that were like 20 pages long and all the rest of it, like to a busy president. Like, that was completely over the top. There's no doubt about that. But again, Wilson never gave him any feedback along those lines. In fact, he wrote to him a couple of times. He did write to him. He said, "Keep writing. I want to hear everything. Don't leave anything out."
Right.
So it's
Mixed
a
and wrong
complete
signals.
exactly. So Page really, after, because as you say, he went back to America in 1916
Mm.
at the request of the State Department. He was ignored by Wilson, uh, Lansing,
Mm.
House, all the key uh,
Mm.
officials in government. Totally ignored him. Didn't want to talk about, even when they did talk with him, they didn't want to talk about the war at all, or, or the relationship with Britain. And then he went back to Britain. He should have really resigned then.
Mm.
Again, talking about alternate histories,
Right.
he could have resigned and gone back to the World's Work. His
Mm.
son Arthur had taken over the editorship of the World's Work, and he could have written articles potentially about what he thought America should do.
Mm.
But I think he wouldn't have undermined Wilson, but I think he
Mm.
might have stirred things up a bit.
Right.
And because I could never understand, and a few people have said this when they're writing about this situation, they can never understand why Wilson stuck with him. But I
Mm.
think that's what the problem was. I think Wilson was worried that if he
Mm.
came back, he would then be a private citizen again
Right.
and could say, well, America needs to take action and just,
Yeah. And his political opponent, 16, Theodore
oh,
Roosevelt,
yeah,
was running on a campaign saying, let's get involved, even though
exactly.
it was a three person. No, he was, yeah, no, normal party there.
But
But yeah,
yeah, but
it's
he
like
was,
it
oh, yeah,
would have,
Roosevelt was very, very strong, very critical of Wilson. Yes, exactly. And yeah, Page and Roosevelt were, I wouldn't call them friends, but they,
hmm,
very much of like of mind and had a lot to do with each other personally
hmm.
over many, many years. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I
Mm,
mean, it's sort of the counterfactual too. I was thinking of like, well, what if Page had stayed on, Halstead had forced him to resign,
yeah,
how different, or if he had come back and done more work with the World Works, like how different could it have been with the United States taking a more activist role rather than
exactly.
um and now I'm blanking on his name, um sort of the Republican Party in Congress taking the
Yeah,
reins away after the Paris Peace Conference.
exactly. Yes, that's right. So Wilson lost control of the agenda.
Yeah.
both internationally and within America.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. And the great irony, of course, that I've pointed out in the letter is that he's the brilliant speech that he gave to Congress in 1917
Mm-hmm.
to convince Congress to declare war on um, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like if you read it as a standalone speech, it's brilliant, like an absolutely brilliant speech. But the context is he'd spent his whole presidential term saying, this is not important. We can
Yeah.
ignore this war. It's not a war for democracy. It's a war that's going on. We need to ignore. And then suddenly he had
Yeah.
to give a brilliant speech like that to actually
Mm-hmm.
convince people.
Yeah.
But he used all the arguments that Page had used in his letters over the years. And that's the great revelation that Page was right.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows whether Page influenced him or not, because Wilson didn't keep any diaries, so we don't know. And I didn't obviously in the book I'm not making any claims along that line, but the
Mm-hmm.
fact is Page was vindicated, and it was the way he was treated was appalling, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. No. It's sort of like it overshadows what could have been a very brilliant life.
It does. Yeah, it was a very sad end.
And
Very
it sort
sad
of
end.
makes you wonder too of how much sort of that ambassadorship, that ignoring by Wilson for the last 4 years of his life kind of
Mm,
impacts us and as historians in the future, forgetting about him and all the work that he did with sort of World Works, Atlantic, State Chronicle, as being a second architect, idea giver to the New South.
yeah, I agree. Definitely. And what it's really overshadowed is the great work he did on education and
Hmm.
public health. Because in, yeah, as I say, and as we talked about before, education was seen as a private matter in the South. If you
Hmm.
wanted to educate your kid, that's fine. You can educate them. You can band together with other parents. You could build a school, get
Hmm.
someone to teach them. It's your business. If you want to do that, that's fine. Or if you want to educate them yourself, or if you want to just teach them how to,
Hmm.
do farming or
Yeah.
whatever, it's up to you. So it's very much seen as a private matter.
Hmm.
And so Page and a few speeches had been given, like to try to turn this around. A few people had tried to start this campaign. But Page's speech, which he gave in 1897, really was the turning point for education in
Hmm.
the South. In that, although he didn't, the actual campaign was started by Richard Ogden from New York.
Hmm.
What Page's speech did, the Forgotten Man, became known as the Forgotten Man speech, but I actually argue it should be called the Forgotten Man and Woman speech
Hmm.
because it actually was about women needing education as much as anything. Um, but what he did with that speech, he gave them a structure for the campaign. He
Hmm.
gave them a touch point. He gave them motivation because it didn't happen for about 3 years later. But he uh, set the spark in motion
Hmm.
for a campaign that turned around education in the South. And there's a statistic in the book about the spending on South education in the South. I think it was just in 1914 was and other types of infrastructure in the South was greater than all the previous years from the end of the Civil War until 1900, something like that. So it just turned around the whole way the governments and even the Southern people thought about education. And the critical thing was they made it a grassroots campaign. So it was Page and most of them were the New South campaigners actually as well, the New South
Hmm.
advocates, most of the people involved in this campaign. But they made a grassroots campaign. So they said to local communities, well, if you want us to help you with a school, give you some money for a school, you need to contribute and you also need to maintain the school once it's set up.
Hmm.
You, you need to prove to us that you can do that. So it was very much grassroots campaign, and it was not the federal. Well, it was nothing to do with the governments anyway, but it was funded by the Rockefellers,
Right.
but it was the local school
Hmm.
authorities, sorry, the local governments
Hmm.
uh, were the ones that actually delivered it to these people. And then so that helped turn around education. And certainly by the time Page left in 1913, the momentum was there. It was really turning around. And it was a cultural change as they realized had to change the way people thought about education. And the other fundamental change that he made was with hookworm,
Hmm.
because he, again, he
You
became
spent a lot
aware
of time on that.
of, sorry,
You spent a lot of time on that topic.
he did. Yeah. And again, he pushed it really hard in the world's work.
Hmm.
But he was sitting in a train with a health expert, and the health expert said, "Oh, someone else in the train in their little group said, 'Oh, what's wrong with that person sitting on the platform?'" And the health expert said, "Well, he's got hookworm."
Hmm.
And Page had just he thought it was just typical Southerner who's lazy and all the rest of it, as was sort of the attitude at the time. And of course, there's a lot of pushback about that as well, because how dare you say that the majority of Southerners have got hookworm, etc., etc.
Hmm.
But it turned out to be correct, and the massive public health campaign was started because Page got them got set them up with the Rockefellers. Rockefellers then
Hmm.
contributed millions of dollars for a 5-year campaign, and massively reduced hookworm. But the critical
Hmm.
thing was that it was actually effectively an education campaign as well, because it had to
Hmm.
educate people
Right.
to cleanse themselves of hookworm, and then improve their sanitation habits so they didn't
Hmm.
get it again. But even more importantly, once they got the hookworm out of their bodies, their minds, uh, you know, vastly improved, and so the attendance at school
Hmm.
increased dramatically. So
Yeah.
kids started going back to schools again, and yeah, and illiteracy rates plummeted
Hmm.
as a result of these campaigns.
Yeah. Well, you just made the case that Page needs more attention.
He does need more attention. Exactly. Yes.
Um, and like I think you mentioned in this at the introduction that it's only like yours is the fifth book on Page, so it was
That's
long
right.
overdue that somebody kind of looked at him and kind of like
Yeah, I
we
think so. And
brought him back to our attention.
that's right. And especially focusing on, for example, his views on racial equality.
Mm.
It's never really been, I've got
Right.
a whole chapter on it. It's never been given that focus before.
Yeah.
And that was one of his, remarkable
Hmm.
ideas
Yeah.
that so far ahead of his time. But he never wanted to be. He never wanted to be that far ahead of his time because he found it hard because he was,
Hmm.
he lost friends. He was ostracized. Even his wife.
Right.
He couldn't take Booker T. Washington, who of course was African American.
Mm.
He couldn't take him back to his house
Right.
to eat because his wife had racial prejudice, as he called
Mm.
it.
Yeah.
So,
The
yeah,
sad reality of the late 19th, early 20th century that he's he's a man ahead of his time.
he was definitely. Yeah.
Well, I said I
Yes.
was going to get you out before 6 o'clock your time, and I'm going to keep my promise there.
Thank you.
But it
Yeah.
was a great pleasure to talk to you, and I think
Oh,
we
thank you.
covered
You
a lot
too.
of ground with the book, but there's still a lot that we didn't talk about that is up for readers to discover, and I hope a lot
Exactly.
of people
Yeah.
will read your biography. I
Thank
guess it's
you.
a certain irony that your book comes out with UGA Press
Yeah.
out of this
Yeah.
great state of Georgia, which is usually more proud of Gradients and New South. But you
That's
bring in
right.
North Carolinian into the conversation of the New South.
Yes. And I'm very grateful to them for publishing it. It's fantastic. Yes.
They're definitely a good press to work with.
They
Um,
are. Definitely. Yep.
but yeah, again, thank you so much for taking
Oh,
Sunday
thank you,
afternoon to
Neil.
chat with me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.